So I'm Brandy Noneke. I'm a postdoc here at CITRIS, the Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society. I'd like to introduce today's CITRIS Research Exchange speaker, Scott Mauvais. And Scott has been with Microsoft for more than 15 years. So congrats, Scott. Good tenure.
Haven't gotten rid of me yet.
He is the Director of Civic Innovation, where he works with local leaders and policy influencers to use technology to address a variety of issues critical to Microsoft, the city, and tech sector generally. Previously, he was the director of the Microsoft Technology Center and Innovation Lab, where Microsoft's top architects help Fortune 500 companies and high-profile startups envision, architect, and prove out solutions based on Microsoft's newest technologies. So with that, I'd like to introduce Scott for his presentation.
Thank you, and thanks all for thanks for coming out and spending an afternoon here. What I thought I'd do is spend half an hour or so talking a bit about what my group's charter is, what we work on in cities, and some of the larger sort of civic engagement space that we do. Then I'll walk through some examples here in San Francisco and across the country that we've done, and I'll wrap up with sort of a conversation of challenges, I guess, that we need to think through: security, privacy, things along those lines, and some of the unintended consequences of sort of this greatness of civic tech. If we're not careful, we need to look at how things pan out. And then I'll try and save 15 minutes or so at the end for questions. I'm just getting back from 2 weeks of travel, and I'm fighting the tail end of a cold, so hopefully I will not have a mid-presentation coughing fit. But if you do, I apologize in advance. So we've all seen slides similar to this, sort of the mega trends, things happening in technology. And I want to put them a little bit in context, less on the technical side, but how they matter to cities, and we'll go from there. So what we're seeing a lot of is really computing disappearing. We're used to having a computer, when I grew up in the industry, where we would go interact with it. And that computer is becoming much more embedded in our phones and sensors and devices. We're spewing off lots of data. And we're really seeing a world where we are amateurizing everything in a good way. So you don't need a lot of professional video equipment to broadcast on YouTube. People are able to build little Internet of Things devices that used to take a great deal of engineering effort. The cloud is cheapening the access to computing resources. So we sort of compare, we add that, what is happening in sort of like the technical landscape, with some of the trends that we're seeing in cities. And what we're seeing, the way I describe it is, when I was doing activism 20 years ago, mostly sort of on the leftish side, there was a lot of us that were demanding that cities go right some wrong. And that's kind of pivoted. And now I'm seeing less of people and sort of the activist community advocating for change. They're just picking up and doing it themselves, because partially it's now possible on a technical level. They don't need the city governments to go do something. They don't need institutions. They can just go build little applications and solve a lot of problems. The computing resources are cheap enough. They're easy enough. And also we've Google and YouTube and Facebook and Amazon recommendations, they've set a new bar for how we expect to interact with services in the commercial world, and people are expecting that same sort of self-service, highly customized experience when they're dealing with government. You know, why is it that when I go to DMV, the traditional example of everything, why isn't it saying, "Oh, welcome, Scott. Here's here's what you could potentially do today. Here is a nice, easy wizard to walk through for registering your car," as opposed to standing in line and going and dealing with a bureaucracy there. So we've reset that expectation. And one of my favorite phrases that I've shamefully stolen from Mayor Shaft is that she says, my expectation of government is I want to interact with government at home, on my couch, at night, in my pajamas. And so, that is sort of the bar of what we're seeing. And so we're seeing all this open data. We're seeing all this, work around civic engagement, really driving to building government solutions that mirror that example. So why cities? So Microsoft believes in that the demographic shift, the economic shift, the political shift of powers back into cities out of the suburbs. We see the majority of GDP being delivered out of cities. In 20 years, 70% of urban populations will be in urban areas. We just, depending on whose demographics you believe, in the last year or maybe this year will pass where 50% of the people actually live in urban areas. We see that money is starting to flow. We're a commercial enterprise, so we like seeing where money's going. $6.4 billion is spent roughly on cities in terms of delivering government services. And a lot of that we think can be done more efficiently. So we want to be part of that conversation for two reasons. One, there's a business opportunity there. Let's be transparent about that. But also, we think as a global tech company that we have a voice to add to this conversation. We understand how to do things at scale. We understand system architectures. We have a global footprint. So as we get interesting ideas that we build out in Chicago, that we build out in San Francisco and New York, we have an organization that can go say, oh, we know how, we have people that work in Dubai. We have people that work in Singapore. We have people who work in Mexico City. And we can take those those solutions and tailor them to the urban areas in that manner. Also, what we're seeing a lot in sort of the civic tech movement is there are a lot of interesting problems that people are solving, but sustainability is a challenge. As I sort of have joked, we all have these great ideas. The problem is and we have hackathons around them, and we get a lot of interest around them. The problem is how do we get them to live past beer on Sunday to hackathon? So what we want to do is how do we, for better or worse, Windows is a 25-year-old operating system. We know how to maintain things over the long haul. How do we bring that knowledge into that civic tech movement so that we design them not only for usability, we design them for security, we design them for to match user needs, we design them to be data-driven, but we also look at them and say, cities build things in generational life cycles. Cities don't change things out as rapidly as we change our cell phones. So how do we help people who are building these applications think through the life cycle that cities work in? So we don't do this alone. This is a sort of a smattering of logos of some of the partners, both here in the Bay Area as well as throughout the country that we spend a lot of time with. And this really is a burgeoning movement around civic tech of people thinking about how do we put philanthropic dollars, how do we put tech thought leadership, how do we bring civic institutions such as Spur, such as libraries, and pair them up with government entities and really think about how we better deliver services to our residents. Because there's a huge opportunity that we've seen a disruption in the commercial space. We want to go do that same thing in the civic area. A couple other things that the team just works on. So I'm going to talk mainly about the city space, the urban areas where I live, but we also work with our academic partners. So we do some work with CITRIS here. We do work with a number of other, mainly research institutions. So if you think of the work that Microsoft does, it really falls in two camps. There's the computer science world that Microsoft Research drives. So they do a lot of work of really inventing the future, as they talk about it, in the technology space around computer science. I don't do that side. My larger team, not my team, but the one I report up to, also looks after the policy end of things. So as we imagine technology progressing, there's going to be inevitable conflicts with regulation, with policy, with what societal needs are. And we want there to be a good academic foundation for that thinking. So when we start having challenges around privacy, when we try and figure out policy around autonomous vehicles, when we try and think about how drones should interact, what's regulation there, we can point to someone whose life work has been researching this area and say, yeah, as opposed to sort of being knee-jerk legislative reaction, maybe we should look at some academics who have been working in that space. So if you go search for technology, academics, policy, or TAP, it's a website that Microsoft runs sort of as a convening location for people who are not necessarily agreeing with Microsoft, but who are doing a lot of thought leadership in areas that are interesting to us. And you can see some of the lists of privacy, security, networks, cloud. You can read the sort of large bucket areas, and then there's individual papers and presentations in that space. There's a lot of fascinating research in that area. And the other thing that we do is some campaign technology. So the sort of the most public thing, if you watched the circus in Iowa, the caucus in Iowa, Microsoft did the media center around that, and we also helped both Republicans and Democrats do the vote tally. So if you remember back to 2012, the Republicans had a little snafu on pre-declaring a winner because they didn't have all the data in. So we were working hard on how do we get more timely, better data around caucus voters, or whatever the proper term for caucuses are. So that was a phone and tablet app, and so there was a lot of great work that sort of our larger team did around that. So back to cities. One of the sort of big drivers that sort of kicked off this entire civic tech movement was the Obama administration in 2009, I believe, sort of declaring that we wanted an open data policy. How do we get more data in the out of government silos and published so that more people can work with that? And so for why it matters is McKinsey did a study. It's a couple years old now, October 2013, that talks about $3 trillion with a T of value that could be unlocked through opening up data. And so they have a very expansive term of open data. So it's not just open data in terms of what we think of that cities publish. That is really sort of free-for-all. They talk, for them, open data is data that is simply accessible. That might include subscription data. That might include data that is published under a particular license. But it's simply a way of being able to access more data. And what they talk about really is three big buckets of value, the three legs of a stool of open data. They talk about increased efficiency, because we are able to make data-driven decisions. We can better route resources to where there is need, both from a government standpoint as well as a private sector standpoint. They talk about transparency, and they talk about entrepreneurialism. So on the transparency side, it's really interesting that people are very skeptical of corporations, of governments, and they complain about, why aren't you doing X? But when you actually show people the data behind it, they become much more supportive of what services government delivers. So that transparency is not only a check to make sure that our government leaders are doing the right things, but it's also an opportunity to drive and help build some confidence in what government officials are doing. So one of my favorite examples is, I think it's Boston, I can't remember the city exactly, had just horrible resident customer satisfaction around their plowing of the roads. People thought it was always too late. It was slow. They weren't prioritizing the right roads. So what the city did is they published out their schedule of what roads they were going to plow, and the status of those various routes. And what that allowed people to do is say, oh yeah, so I'm not really plowed for 48 hours, but probably the main thoroughfare really is more important than my side street. And that other side street, oh, that's the school bus route. Yeah, that probably should be plowed first too. And it sort of showed the ordering of what would be plowed and the rationale for doing that. And not only did people understand what the government was doing, but that really drove a lot of the satisfaction of the snow removal program, because people really weren't saying, it wasn't really a black box. It could always be done better. It was something that they understood. And if you look at sort of the entrepreneurialism, the ability to build new businesses off of data is I think, something that we're going to see more and more of. A lot of companies really are becoming data companies. Essentially, Google is a data company. They sell advertising, but they're selling really is they build a great company on packaging up the data of the web and exposing that to what you want right now. Uber is really built on largely on the public GPS systems, because that is a great way to match supply of drivers to demand of riders to a particular location. So how do we get drivers to the right place in general, because there's a lot of people here looking for rides. We know them based on their cell phone locations, and we can route drivers to that. And also then once we know sort of matching aggregate demand, we can actually match at a micro level me to that driver. And that's all mitigated, not mitigated, that's all brokered by GPS location. And then I can now have a driver that doesn't know my city intimately because I can route them very easily based on those GPS coordinates. And so that's a $50-odd billion company that's been built on some open data. You can look at companies that are building data on companies around transparency, around government finances. These are all great things that once we get that data, there are entrepreneurial opportunities around that. So the three legs of how do we get greater efficiency because data-driven decisions are better than hunches typically. How do we encourage entrepreneurialism and how do we encourage transparency? And sort of putting all those together, McKinsey says $3 trillion. Now you can quibble with whether they've overestimated, underestimated, but order of magnitude, $3 trillion is a big number. And so how do we go drive some of that? And I think we've seen similar examples in the past where we have sort of little changes that have great second and third order effects. So electricity is the one here. So electricity was great. First off, it was around how do we move factories out how do we get factories to a location where they are less dependent on primarily water power at the time. So, at the time, we had a lot of industry build up around waterways, but electricity let us build factories where there wasn't necessarily easy access to steam. But we also got great things of air conditioning. So now, in hot climates, people could work during the day as opposed to just evenings. We were able to get second and third shifts because people were able to work in the dark. Here we got a refrigerator because now we could keep food healthy. And then those are a lot of things that obviously we think through the benefits of rural electrification. We think through the productivity benefits that we brought to business, but also just greatly changed society in terms that were not necessarily immediately thought through, similar to the way of GPS that was originally for military targeting, then became ways of keeping me from getting lost when I'm out hiking in Yosemite, and now we have car sharing services built on top of that. A similar example around interstate highways gives us just-in-time manufacturing so that I can get my resources directly to where I want as opposed to having to be the terminus of a railway. It, for better or worse, drove the burgeoning suburbs. It allowed people to have a completely different lifestyle. I think we're now seeing sort of some of the negative effects of that, and people are moving back into urban areas. But that investment in roadways not only spurred a geographic expansion of the United States, but also built the entire logistics industry and built the suburbs and really built the auto industry. So that's sort of the macro level. I want to hit a couple examples. So in Chicago, there's a large lots program. So what this essentially takes is, I don't know if it's all blighted land, but it's essentially vacant plots of land that the city puts up, forgives back taxes, and lets people buy them for $1 if they live next door to it and they're going to put it to some productive use. This has been around for quite a while, and in 3 years, how many plots of land, take a guess, did they sell? Not quite, but close. 30. So you walk up to room 905, do some research, find out what's available. You see a plot of land. Do you qualify? Long, arduous process. 3 years, 30 plots of land. They brought this online. So it's a great example of matching activists who want to put productive use. It's a city that wants to get them off their books and actually have citizens generating some economic activity around it. It's civic technologists who see a problem that want to go solve it. And there's policy people because we made some changes. So one of the changes was instead of being next door, they allowed next door to be within a block radius. They use this great thing called online maps. So, where are you? And here are the plots of land that are available. And you could online go through and walk through a wizard and apply, I don't know if that's the proper choice of words, to purchase this land for $1. In 3 months, how many do you think they sold? 300. So simply, and this is not hard technology. This is, I don't want to call this a weekend's work, but this is not a high bar to take city plots of land, put it on a map, and walk through a wizard that says, here's the frequently asked questions of what you need to apply, and here's a form to go fill out, and a way of finding out if your use qualifies. And 100x improvement in terms of usage. This is I think 2012, 2013 is when they kicked this off, and they're just setting up the next set of plots of land that will be able to be purchased by the end of April. So example there, also from Chicago, UI Labs, not to be confused with University of Illinois. It's University Industry Labs. And what they're trying to do, it's a consortium of 4 universities in the Chicago area, 5 or 6 companies, a bunch of civic groups, and all, I think, 11 departments in the city government to really use the city of Chicago as a lab to go build out and try to solve big, tough urban engineering problems. So 2 examples from that are smart green infrastructure and underground mapping. So Chicago has a problem with rain runoff. River runs backwards every now and then. It floods. And there's a lot of people throughout the country that have tried to do interesting things around green infrastructure for how do we do a better job of managing all this runoff. The problem is no one has any data for what actually works. So what UI Labs is doing with Microsoft is building a layer of Internet of Things, smart pavers that measure the amount of water going through them, the quality of the water that gets down to the dirt underneath, the same thing around native species for how much water is diverted. And what we're trying to, and marrying that up with some cloud analytics, and what we're trying to do is learn what is actually effective in terms of being able to mitigate excess water, as well as what impacts the quality of the water flowing through, and what matters differently for maybe things that are different on sandy ground versus city infrastructure versus suburban versus playgrounds, trying to understand, so we actually have some data around that green infrastructure, and we can then go and figure out what works best in different scenarios. The other is the underground infrastructure of the city. Chicago's a fairly old city. They don't know what all is underground. They don't have good maps of that. So there's a couple things that that leads to. One is it's delays when people start digging. They find something new, and they go, oh, now we have to dig around that. So construction's a problem. It's a safety hazard because occasionally you find things that blow up underground that you probably don't want to dig into. So how do we get a better understanding there? And there's also a revenue opportunity because this is permitted, and there's a cost around cost recapturing based on what you dig through, and depending on what there's missed revenue opportunities because they don't know what not everything is priced appropriately. So what we're building is a big sort of a 3D model for what is under the surface of Chicago that talks about all the electrical, gas, water, subway, all the various infrastructure underground, and how do we sort of wiki-style build a way of letting people contribute to that. And there's a security side of that too, because there's things that run through the city that we may not want bad people to know about. So how do we share that in a way that provides an opportunity for people who should have a need to know to go and find that information, but doesn't expose critical infrastructure to people who really don't have a reason to know that. So here you got a photo of a nice chunk of land they've dug up with a nice mess of things underneath and 3 guys looking in the hole. Pick up the pace here a little bit. So these are a couple sort of researchy examples of things that are interesting. Kinect game controller. Interestingly, it's very good at tracking joints, which is important for me if I want to play a game. Oddly, tracking joints is also pretty good for physical therapy. So what we've found is that we can do some analysis on people's gait and walk and determine how they're progressing in physical therapy. So we have a lot of doctors who are using this to help prioritize who they should be working with. People that are progressing well, we devote fewer resources to because we don't need to check in with them. People who are progressing less well, we can devote more resources to so that they need more physical therapy. I think this is primarily around stroke victims, if I remember properly. And then this has a real-world example, is I'm trying to see which University of Missouri is using this in a assisted living facility where they've instrumented the room with Kinects, and they're able to monitor the residents walking around. And I think it's 14 days they're able to do some machine learning against that to predict when people will fall. And so they're able to take interventions ahead of time to give them walkers, to give them fall training, to maybe move them into a different level of care so that they have fewer falls. And that's all based on just research around tracking how people move. And there's also when we can there's also things of being able to identify how badly people fall. So we can gauge the speed that they fall. We understand what joints they hit. And most importantly, we can find out if they get up or not. Do we need to send someone there to take care of them, or have we seen if they've gotten up and moved along? I'm going to skip that one. So last example I want to give is drones, because I have learned recently that there's no good technical presentation in 2015 that doesn't mention drones. So this is just a requisite drone slide. So what we're doing in the South Caribbean is we're flying drones around and capturing mosquitoes. Because what we want to do is understand potential disease outbreaks. So it's sort of an early warning system. This is a pilot. Sort of an early warning system of disease pathogens. We're taking this data that we're collecting and then running essentially the genetic fingerprint of these of the mosquitoes through a bunch of cloud analytics to understand mutation of genes to see if there are new pandemics that are breaking out. Right now we're trying to understand sort of what the baseline is there. A lot of this work comes out of, oddly, some anti-spam work we did in the 90s with Hotmail, detecting how spam mutates, because we'd set up filters and spam would come in and they'd get around that. And one of our spam researchers was talking to one of our medical researchers, and so it turns out that the way that the spam mutates is nearly identical to the way the HIV virus mutates. So if you look at almost all the research around HIV since the late 90s has all referenced a particular piece of Microsoft work around spam detection that has been repurposed towards HIV detection, and that generated, I think, $140 billion of NIH funding to help further that side. So there's a lot of sort of interesting things that you would never imagine that comes out of the computer science world that matches over into sort of the healthcare world. So these are all the sort of the good things that that can come from marrying technology in the civic arena. We need to be careful about some other things, though. So one is security. It's all fine and dandy when I get a virus on my computer, and it's unfortunate when it infects some of my files, when it renders my machine slow. It's a completely different thing when there's an exploit in your pacemaker. Or completely different when there's an exploit in the electrical grid or in the dam control. The digital becomes physical, and that's when people start to die. So we really need to think through how do we secure these systems? How do we be better at building trust into them? And what is the appropriate role, and how do we have backup systems around that? So that's something we as an industry have been working on. Microsoft has had its Trustworthy Computing Group since 2002. We do a lot of work with Rockefeller Foundation and their 100 Resilient Cities around, we've taken sort of a cyber resilience side. But it's an area where we need to think more so and more deeply around that. Related is privacy. Privacy and security often go hand in hand. But I think we as a society need to think through and what role we expect want from our governments and our technology providers in trading in our private information. Because there's a lot of great things that we, the technology industry, could deliver in terms of personalizing services, but at some point it becomes creepy. The first time Amazon recommendations or Netflix recommendations I saw, I was like, oh my God. That's just weird. And now I love it. They give me great recommendations. It's wonderful. So we can do a great, potentially, not we, Microsoft, we, technology providers, have access to your calendar. We know where you're going. We know where your spouse is going. We could know who your friends are. How do we better align traffic around that? How do we make sure we route you by the grocery store because it's the Super Bowl and you want some beer as we're running through? These are all services we could provide. We could do a lot better job of being able to use sensors around us to determine health. So back to my Connect example. If you have a degenerative hip disease, your Connect could be monitoring that and could send you an alert saying, hey, you've deteriorated a bit. You should go see a doctor. Or that scratching sound that you can't hear, but our high-resolution microphones pick up, could be termites. These are all great things, but they all might be creepy. And I think we, as a society, need to think through what's of value to us, and how do we safeguard that data so that we know that it's used in our best interests and not exploited in a way that we are uncomfortable with. 8 months or so ago, I attended. There was a great data and ownership conference here that CITRIS ran. It was a sort of with INRIA in Paris. So there's a lot of European contingents as well as U.S. based. I thought it was really sort of interesting the tone of skepticism of what people were concerned about. A lot of us in North America were very concerned of government transacting with that data and what they could do with that. And the Europeans tend to be more concerned about what private enterprise and private entities would be doing with that data. It was just an interesting, different view on data. Algorithms, computers are very good at optimizing. They can do things a lot more quickly, a lot better, a lot more repeatably. Oh, that was a great sentence. More repeatably than humans. The challenge is that they're good at optimizing. They're not necessarily good at value judgment. So we talk a lot about smart buildings and how much better the world is going to be when we can start making better use of lights and heating and water and be less wasteful. But is that smart building optimizing for energy efficiency? Is it optimizing for cost? Is it optimizing for comfort? Is it optimizing for green energy? Is nuke green energy? So these are all great value decisions that get coded in to software somewhere. And we need a way to make sure that we all agree that, yeah, cost is most important because we care about digital divide and equity, and we don't want this only to be for wealthy. Or we really have a long-term problem around climate change, and we really need this to be green. Or this needs to be a comfortable building. I don't necessarily have an opinion on that, but we need to be a way to build that in, have algorithms start thinking through the value judgments that we expect them as opposed to simply optimizing. Another impact, anybody know what this is a photo of? These are the first computers, because computers used to be a term for people who did calculations. So primarily women, war effort, and then initially into early space age, and then transistors reduced a lot of the need for the calculation. Yeah. I believe this is, I believe from the background, this is military bombing rates. Yeah, yeah. I stole this from, Creative Commons appropriately reused this photo, and I don't remember the exact context. But as we're bringing machine learning, as we're automating more things, we've always talked about whatever the new technical revolution is going to decimate jobs, and it never has happened. There's always been new jobs. But this is a different class of things. We need to find a way to how do we prepare people for a different type of work when a lot of the sort of mid-tier jobs that have been the underpinning of a lot of middle class and professional jobs get replaced by machine learning and smart algorithms. So it's once again not a problem. We just need to think through how we're going to prepare society for that. And my last point, and I'll take questions, is we need to be careful of digital equity issues. If you think back, I remember when the internet first came along, this was going to be the great democratizing thing. Everyone was going to be wonderful. We were going to get rid of all those big media powers, and life was going to be wonderful. And it turned out that we concentrated a lot of power. We brought in a lot more voices. Everyone can now be published, but we also exacerbated some challenges. And I think we could see we had that same risk that we need to be cognizant of in the civic space. 211, sorry, not 211, 311, see, click, fix. Take your smartphone, take a photo, and then tell the city government to fix that pothole. Hey, that was going to get city resources more distributed around cities, as opposed to just people who had access and could complain about the street lights in their neighborhood. Well, it turns out not everyone has cell phones. And more importantly, not everyone wants to raise their hand and be found and be seen complaining about government. So what we imagined is a way that we would have a lot more distribution of resources in the cities. We see it actually, if you look at the 311 data from See, Click, Fix, you see a lot of it back in the same neighborhoods because underserved communities aren't self-identifying to come and say, I want better city services. So as we think through bringing more technology that could be better democratizing, better serving residents, we need to make sure that we are serving all residents and not just the privileged residents that are the early adopters. So with that, I'll hit the last slide. So a couple Twitter handles. The larger team, Microsoft SV, is in Silicon Valley. L. Scott, disambiguation from college. When I was the liberal Scott, we had an F. Scott that fancied himself to be a bit of a fascist. And still is a bit. And then there's a team blog. So feel free to engage in conversation there. And I'd love to entertain some questions. Nothing's off limits. I may pass if I don't have a good example, but answer. But feel free to fire anything away. And thank you, Lynn. This has been, I've enjoyed the privilege talking to you.
Okay, so questions, and please wait for the microphone so that those who are watching by webcast can hear your question. Question.
So thank you for touching on the kind of creepiness of really smart and involved technology. And you kind of talked about the importance of how do you approach the public with that kind of technology without scaring them away, or is it just kind of a matter of time and waiting for them to get used to it for things to really take off? What have you found from your experience?
That's such a great question. I think there's a divergence of view in the tech community. One is the sky is falling and we've lost all privacy, and the other is get over it, privacy doesn't matter. And I think somewhere in the middle is where it is. I think there's really sort of two conversations. I think we as an industry need to do a lot better in terms of talking about trustworthiness and building in so that people understand what we're doing with the data, making that in understandable terms so that it's not a 30-page EULA. Microsoft just went through an exercise of sort of standardizing all of our privacy policies across our products with a sort of friendly-ish summary of this is what we do, and then with links to more detail. And when we think about privacy, we talk a lot about, similar to the medical world, of informed consent. This is the data we're collecting. This is what we're going to do with it. This is how long we're going to keep it. I think it's important for people to know that. Then I think we need both technical and policy controls that will enforce how that data is used. So how do we use encryption? How do we use differential encryption to make sure that only people have access that can see it? Similar to the city infrastructure in the UI Labs conversation of the underground infrastructure, there's a lot of data in there. We want to make sure that both in terms of policy and in terms of technical implementation that's not shareable. And I think we need to do a lot better job of explaining to people the value that we as an industry could provide if we had trustworthy access to information about people. in the healthcare space, if we shared genomes, there's a lot that we could do around personalizing medicine. On the other hand, people are creeped out by there's nothing more personal than your genetic infrastructure, not genetic fingerprint, and if that were to be used for insurance rating decisions. If that were to be used for discrimination of, you're really not appropriate for this type of work because of this. My own standpoint, I not necessarily speak for Microsoft, is that we as a tech industry need a shared understanding of what that is, and we'll go build to that. And if people say we need hardcore privacy, and it needs to be locked down, that's going to limit some of the value we can provide. But that's OK. That's what society wants, and we will build to that. If people say it's a free-for-all, we can go build great services on that free-for-all. What we can't effectively go do is go deliver free-for-all with lots of value when people are creeped out by it. We need to build that trust. And that's, I think, that what we, Microsoft, are doing a lot with around our privacy side. We've been talking about trustworthy computing since 2002. And if people don't trust us with their infrastructure to be both secure and maintain their privacy, we can't be successful as an industry. And thanks for the questions. It's very important, and I think hopefully symposiums like this will get people thinking about that, and we can collectively drive to what is the right decision that mirrors the values that we have as a society. Yeah. Hey.
Just a quick note of information for my question.
Yeah.
On your security point,
yeah.
There's a hospital in Southern California that's being held hostage by...
I saw that headline.
You heard about that? OK.
I didn't read the detail, but
yeah,
I saw
they encrypted all of the medical records, and they're demanding a $3 million ransom to provide the unencrypt. So my question, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk about the fact that people are moving back out of the suburbs and into the central cities. Suburbs have a lot of smaller cities, and many of those cities, like here in eastern Contra Costa County, are becoming very impoverished. Mm-hmm. So I think we have a perfect storm of the demographics of those cities changing because all of the sort of tech-oriented, highly talented, high-income individuals are moving into the city, and then everyone else who is getting priced out is moving into these smaller cities. And at the same time, these smaller cities lack the kind of sophistication that a New York or a Chicago or a San Francisco has. Does Microsoft, or do you have any thoughts about how we can help those smaller cities? Yeah, so
it's a great challenge in that not only do we have people getting priced out of cities, but it's expensive to deliver services in broad rural areas. Rural electrification is that was very expensive to do the last probably 100 miles, not even the last mile. How do you get that out? So it's easier to deliver services in concentrated areas. So I think the hope is that as we, digital tools, digital products, digital infrastructure scales very well. The millionth and first electron costs as much as the millionth electron in the first electron. So things, and particularly with cloud computing, that has a lot less capital requirements that cities need to implement. As we get more and more services that are delivered digitally through a digital front door, as opposed to going down and having to worry about how do I get myself down to City Hall, how do I deal with transit, how do I take time off from work, because I can't take time off or stand in line. If we can do more of that, as Libby Schaaf said, at home, at night, on your couch, in your pajamas, that service can be delivered nearly as cheaply in rural Kern County as it can in downtown San Francisco County. And the cost of building those solutions are a lot cheaper. The expensive thing is that cities have a lot of legacy infrastructure that's just hard to integrate in with. So I suspect, personally, that we will see the large cities that have larger IT budgets being the first movers, and then that cascading down once those models get proven out. We're seeing that in open data, where the large cities that can dedicate a headcount or two to a chief data officer and a program manager are building out great data portals. And what those then they're traditionally very open source focused, and then they are able to be implemented much more cheaply by follow-on cities. So hopefully the fine world of technology will over time make it financially possible for cities to deliver high-quality services even in they're not dense urban areas.